Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer where we're diving straight into the fascinating history of the Golden Age. We're going to prove a pretty major concept today. State survival absolutely requires both collecting money and maintaining moral legitimacy. You see, historical records tell us that a nation might actually survive a military defeat for a while. It might survive famine, devastating disease, or even the madness of an incompetent emperor. But if it loses two things at the exact same time, its legitimacy in the eyes of its people and its ability to collect taxes, well, the entire foundation just crumbles. So today, we're looking at one of history's most audacious political experiments to really understand how money, faith, and power collided in the ancient world.
Okay, so here's the big question we need to unpack. How do you build a powerful empire without making your rule look like blatant robbery? Because, let's face it, no state survives solely on military might or a competent emperor. It absolutely needs the silent consent of its people. When we think of ancient taxation, we usually picture either brutal oppression or some magnificent sacred duty. But the reality for the Golden Empire was far more complex and honestly a lot more calculating. They had to figure out a way to extract resources to fund their massive state apparatus without their subjects feeling like they were just being robbed blind.
Section 1. The foundation of the empire. Setting the groundwork. To build this empire, rulers didn't just use swords, they used ledgers and laws.
Now, what's really interesting here is that taxation wasn't just financial extraction, it was a deeply institutional tool that defined the entire social order. Literally, it was the ultimate sorting mechanism. It dictated exactly who was on the inside and who was on the outside. If you paid a certain way, you got state protection, famine relief, and roads. The tax system was the very backbone of their society, defining everything from who belongs to the community to who's marginalized and even who has to step up and provide military service.
Moving on to Section 2, the sun tax, a sacred duty. To truly understand this deeply structured order, we really have to look at the empire's first, and arguably most brilliant, institutional invention. The state essentially masked an agricultural productivity tax in a divine, mystical form. The sun tax was mandatory for all followers of the Church of the Sun, which was the official religion of the empire. But instead of a standard flat income tax, it was based entirely on sunlight. Basically, during the planting season, priests would come out, meticulously measure the angle of the sun hitting a plot of land, and calculate the tax owed. I know, it sounds incredibly mystical, but functionally, it was just a highly effective property tax based on how productive that agricultural land was expected to be. The crucial point here is that farmers actually felt they were performing a sacred ritual to ensure the cycle of light and harvest. This turned a pretty mundane tax payment into an act of supreme morality. Because it was so heavily draped in the divine, the taxpayers just didn't feel exploited. When a farmer brought his grain to the temple, he wasn't paying off a debt to some faceless bureaucrat. He genuinely believed he was physically feeding the god that gave him his harvest. The emperor wasn't a tax collector, right? He was the vital mediator between humanity and the sun. This was absolute genius. It transformed economic extraction into a deeply moral, totally voluntary act.
Section 3. The Dark Tribute. Taxing non-believers. Of course, the empire stretched across vast continents, and millions worshipped other gods. No empire rules only over its faithful followers.
So, since forced religious conversion turned out to be a massive failure, the state had to come up with a practical compromise, which was essentially a fee for living within its borders. The empire initially tried to force these millions of pagans, people who worshipped the earth, the water, or their ancestors, to convert to the Church of the Sun. It completely failed. And why? Well, because a farmer forced to pray to the sun might still grow rice, but he's not going to hand over that rice with genuine faith. The sun tax only worked if the payer genuinely believed. So they invented the dark tribute. You didn't have to convert, and you didn't have to die. You just had to pay a mandatory portion of your annual income, usually grain, animal skins, or metal, in exchange for state protection.
Now, on the surface, this looks highly unequal. The non-believers obviously paid a heavier financial burden because they weren't part of the core moral community. They didn't get access to the grain reserves during famines, and they definitely couldn't tap into temple funds. But you have to admit, the empire was remarkably pragmatic here. In exchange for this heavier transactional tax, the pagans were exempt from serving in the military, they were protected from foreign enemies, and, crucially, they were allowed to keep their own local laws and customs.
The followers of the sun pay tribute. The non-believers pay tribute. This specific quote was inscribed on stone tablets at every single city gate, ensuring absolutely everyone knew their exact place in the hierarchy. The empire didn't try to hide this division. They literally carved it into stone for everyone to see. And because the rules of the game were so clearly defined, both groups just accepted it. The believers felt spiritually superior and cared for, while the non-believers accepted a harsh but ultimately fair transactional contract. This dual system perfectly maintained state legitimacy without the empire having to constantly deploy its army to squeeze money out of its people.
Section 4. Cracks in the system. Because as we know, success often breeds corruption. For 3 centuries, this system successfully filled coffers and built bustling temples.
But then human nature kicked in, and the elites literally blocked out the sun to avoid their sacred duties. Since the tax was based strictly on sunlight, the nobility and clergy, who of course owned almost all the land, figured out an absurd loophole. They started bribing the priests who measured the sunlight, they built massive high walls to physically block the morning sun from hitting their estates, they even planted giant trees to cast artificial shade, totally legally dodging the taxman. By artificially manipulating the sunlight, they drastically reduced their tax obligations. This meant the entire heavy burden of funding the empire shifted straight onto the poor farmers working in the wide-open, unshaded fields. A system meant to be beautifully fair just turned into an engine of inequality from the inside out.
Meanwhile, a massive demographic time bomb was ticking. In the early days of the empire, the system worked perfectly, because the vast majority of the population, around 80%, was completely bought into the moral story of the sun god. The pagans were just a small, easily managed 20% minority, whose extra financial contributions were just a nice little bonus for the treasury. But as the empire kept expanding its territory, that non-believer population ballooned to a staggering 50%. Through continuous expansion, the empire absorbed more and more diverse peoples who had absolutely no connection to the Church of the Sun. So suddenly, half the empire is paying this heavy transactional tax without receiving any of the deep communal benefits of the believers.
Finally, we reach the late empire, where pagans made up 2/3 of the population. Just think about that shift for a second. The people paying the dark tribute were no longer a fringe minority. They were the overwhelming marginalized majority. The financial burden of the entire Golden Empire shifted almost entirely onto the backs of people who were actively excluded from its moral community.
And that leads to a very natural question from the people: why should we pay tribute to a god we do not believe in? This boiling dissatisfaction led the marginalized majority to fundamentally question the empire's legitimacy. They realized they were funding a state that gave them nothing but conditional protection. And at the exact same time, the poor sun believers were being totally crushed by the tax evasion of their own elites. The grand story that justified the taxes was completely falling apart for absolutely everyone.
Section 5. The Fall of the Empire. The Fatal Cycle. Instead of reforming the system, the rulers basically panicked and leaned right into force.
Let's look at this fatal cycle, because it's exactly what destroys empires when a government resorts to violence to collect taxes. The Golden Kings declared that anyone refusing the tribute was an enemy of the sun, and they sent in the military. But this just accelerated the collapse. When citizens refused to pay and evaded taxes, the state had to increase military control. But armies are incredibly expensive, right? So the state had to raise taxes even higher to pay those soldiers. This entirely eroded whatever trust was left. Even the devout sun followers started asking, hey, if our taxes are truly sacred, why are they being used to feed an army that is oppressing us?
And this perfectly illustrates a major historical point. The empire didn't fall to a stronger outside army, it fell because the state's moral order had so completely collapsed that no one even bothered to lock the doors. In the final decades, priests were still out there measuring sunlight, but the temples were empty. Royal envoys were collecting tribute, but only when flanked by heavily armed mercenaries. When a rebel army, which was this united front of angry pagans and exploited, stripped-bare sun farmers, finally marched on the dazzling capital, there was no grand siege. They found the golden gates left wide open. The empire had already entirely hollowed itself out from the inside.
Section 6. Lesson from the past. The truths of human society. Because the mechanics of these ancient empires aren't just trivia. They're really a mirror reflecting our own world.
The ultimate takeaway here is that money is never just money. It is belief, it is power, and it is order. When a government's tax collection becomes an elite game or just a blatant symbol of oppression, the justifying moral order dies, and the state inevitably dies right along with it. Every state, ancient or modern, has to collect money. But only the states that make that collection part of a larger story, a story of justice, protection, and belonging, can actually endure. Once people realize a state is only taking their money to sustain its own bloated apparatus, that moral justification just evaporates.
So, I'll leave you with this final thought to ponder. What happens to modern institutions when their people lose faith in the story behind their money? While we might not have priests measuring the sunlight in our backyards anymore, the underlying truth remains exactly the same. There is nothing more fragile than an authority that has lost the ability to convince its people that their contributions are being put to good use. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the structures around you.